Have you ever carried a burden so heavy that you believed it could never be revealed? The deepest wounds often hide where no one can see, yet those very moments can become the beginning of an extraordinary journey shaped by God's grace. Pain has a way of isolating us. Fear convinces us to stay quiet. Even so, God's presence remains constant, bringing hope where despair once lived and light where darkness seemed endless. Welcome to Unknown Speaker, where authentic Christian testimonies reveal the transforming power of Jesus Christ through real lives and real experiences. Today's story is a remarkable account of redemption, perseverance, and unwavering mercy that proves no life is beyond God's reach. A true Christian story of faith, despair, and the God who never let go. Part 1. Some secrets don't stay buried. There are moments in life that divide everything into two parts. The life you lived before, and the life you never expected to have afterward. For Grace, that moment didn't happen inside a hospital. It didn't happen during a church service. And it didn't happen when she found faith. It happened because of an old yellow envelope. One she had spent more than 3 decades making sure no one would ever see. If you had walked into our little church on any Sunday morning, you would have noticed Grace without realizing you had. She wasn't loud. She never stood on the platform. She didn't sing solos or teach Bible studies to large crowds. She simply had the kind of presence that made people feel safe. Children ran to hug her before they greeted their own Sunday school teachers. The elderly looked for her after every service because she never seemed too busy to listen. Young couples often asked if she would pray with them before a wedding. If someone received devastating news during the week, people would quietly say, "Call Grace," not because she always had the right words, but because somehow, after sitting with her for a while, the weight felt lighter. No one could explain why. Not even Grace. She always smiled and said, "I'm just pointing people toward the one who carried me." Most of us assumed she meant God had helped her through ordinary struggles. We had no idea how much that sentence actually cost her. Grace followed the same routine every Sunday for 32 years. She parked beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the parking lot. She arrived early enough to hear the choir rehearsing. She greeted Mr. Harold, the elderly usher, with the same joke every week. "If you save my seat, I'll save you a peppermint." He always laughed. She always handed him 2 peppermints anyway. Then she'd walk into the sanctuary, remove her light blue cardigan, fold it neatly across the back of the pew, and sit in the 3rd row. Left side, never the right. If someone happened to be sitting there, she didn't ask them to move. She simply waited, patiently, quietly, as though there were nowhere else in the room she could possibly sit. Most people assumed it was habit. It wasn't. It was survival. No one knew that, because Grace had become remarkably skilled at making pain look like peace. She knew exactly how long to smile before it looked forced. She knew how to answer, "How are you?" without ever saying anything true. She knew how to cry without making a sound. And perhaps most painfully of all, she knew how to worship while carrying questions she was afraid to speak out loud. Looking back now, the signs were there all along. Whenever a door slammed unexpectedly, Grace's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. When voices grew loud in the church fellowship hall, she instinctively looked toward the nearest exit before reminding herself where she was. If someone walked behind her without warning, she startled more than seemed natural. Most of us never noticed. Those who did simply assumed she was nervous by nature. They couldn't have known those reactions had been rehearsed since childhood. For Grace, safety had never been something you felt. It was something you constantly searched for. And even after all those years, part of her was still searching. Everything changed on an ordinary Sunday in October. The sermon had ended. Families gathered in the lobby over coffee. Children laughed as they chased each other between folding tables, while parents apologized with embarrassed smiles. One by one, cars pulled out of the parking lot. Within 20 minutes, the sanctuary was nearly empty. I was helping stack hymnals when I noticed something unusual. Grace was still sitting in her pew. She never stayed that long. At first I thought she might be praying. Then I realized she wasn't moving at all. She sat perfectly still, both hands resting on something in her lap. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting shifting colors across the wooden floor. Blue, gold, deep crimson. From where I stood, I couldn't tell what she was holding, only that she kept gently running her thumb across its edge, over and over again, as though touching it required courage. I walked toward her. Grace. She looked up. For the first time since I'd known her, her smile didn't reach her eyes. Do you have a minute? There was something different about her voice. Not sadness. Not fear. Relief. The kind of relief people feel when they've finally decided to stop carrying something alone. I sat beside her. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. Felt sacred. Finally, she turned what she had been holding toward me. It was an envelope. Old. Yellowed with age. Its corners were soft from being handled countless times. There was no address. No stamp. No name. Only a single crease running across the middle where it had been folded and unfolded so often the paper looked ready to split apart. I almost burned this. Her voice was barely above a whisper. More times than I can count. I looked at the envelope, then back at her. What is it? She lowered her eyes. For 32 years, she said slowly, I believed this needed to die with me. The sanctuary suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, I could hear leaves brushing across the sidewalk in the autumn wind. Inside, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Grace took a long breath. When people tell me they admire my faith, she smiled sadly. I always wonder what they'd think if they knew the truth. I didn't answer. Something told me this wasn't the moment to interrupt. She continued tracing the edge of the envelope with her thumb. You know why I sit in this pew every Sunday? I've always wondered. She looked toward the sanctuary doors. From here, she said softly, I can see every entrance. I glanced around the room. She was right. Every doorway, every exit, all visible from exactly where she sat. I've done that since the first Sunday I came here. I frowned. Why? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were glistening. Because little girls who grow up waiting for bad news. Her voice broke. Never stop watching the doors. Then she placed the envelope in my hands. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow, it felt heavier than anything I had ever held. She looked directly at me. If someone hadn't knocked on my bedroom door one night in the spring of 1994, a tear slipped silently down her cheek. This envelope would have been the last thing I ever wrote. She folded her trembling hands together. I've never told anyone what happened that night. She looked toward the cross hanging above the platform, then back at me. I think it's finally time. And with those words, Grace stepped back into a memory she had spent 32 years trying to outrun. Grace was 7 years old the first time she realized that adults could lie without saying a single word. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Her mother was making chicken soup, humming an old hymn under her breath while the pot simmered on the stove. The kitchen smelled of onions, garlic, and fresh bread warming in the oven. To anyone looking through the window, it would have seemed like an ordinary family dinner. Then Grace heard it. Not the truck. The silence. Her mother's humming stopped in the middle of a sentence. The wooden spoon rested against the edge of the pot. She looked toward the window over the sink. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Grace had learned that silence could carry a message long before she could explain it. A moment later came the familiar sound of tires crunching across the gravel driveway. Then the engine shut off. Her little brother kept playing with his toy cars on the living room rug. He was too young to notice. Grace wasn't. She watched her mother smooth the front of her apron with trembling hands. Go wash your hands for dinner, her mother said gently. It sounded like every other evening. But it wasn't. Not really. The front door opened. Heavy boots crossed the hallway. Each step seemed louder than the last. Grace could tell what kind of night it might become simply by the rhythm of those footsteps. Some nights they were slow. Some nights they were hurried. Tonight, they were heavy. Her father walked into the kitchen without looking at anyone. He smelled of sweat, engine oil, and cigarette smoke. For one brief moment, no one spoke. Then he forced a smile. "Something smells good." Her mother smiled back. "So does peace," she answered softly. Grace never forgot that sentence. Because peace never came. Not that night. Not many nights after that. The arguments rarely began with anything important. A bill that couldn't be paid. A broken appliance. A forgotten errand. Small things. But to a frightened child, the reason didn't matter. Only the volume did. Grace learned to gather her brother and disappear into their bedroom before voices became shouting. She would sit on the floor beside his bed, making up stories about brave knights and hidden castles while covering the sounds coming from the other side of the wall. When dishes shattered, she'd clap her hands and laugh. "See," she'd whisper, "the dragons missed us again." Her brother believed her. She was grateful for that. Years later, he would tell people he barely remembered those nights. Grace remembered everyone. Not because she wanted to, because her body never forgot. At school, teachers called her mature. She never interrupted class. She always finished her work. She smiled when adults spoke to her. She thanked the lunch ladies. She apologized even when something wasn't her fault. Everyone thought she was simply well-behaved. No one realized she had become an expert at reading faces before she learned long division. She could tell when a smile was genuine. She could tell when someone was pretending. She could sense anger before a single word was spoken. Those weren't gifts. They were survival skills. Church became the one place where she could breathe. Every Sunday, her grandmother would arrive in a faded blue sedan that smelled faintly of peppermint and old leather Bibles. Before they walked inside, her grandmother always reached over and squeezed Grace's hand. "Ready?" Grace always nodded. She didn't have the words for what she felt. Only that the little white church seemed different from every other place in her life. People laughed without fear. Doors opened without shouting. No one flinched when someone raised their hands, because they were raising them in worship. For the first time, Grace saw grown men cry without shame. She watched elderly women sing through tears that looked more like hope than heartbreak. Confused her. She had never seen adults carry pain without letting it become cruelty. One Sunday, after the service, she asked her grandmother a question that had been quietly growing in her heart. "If God is our Father," her grandmother looked down and smiled. "Yes. Is he ever angry like mine?" Her grandmother stopped walking. She knelt until they were eye to eye. Then she brushed a loose strand of hair behind Grace's ear. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, "God is nothing like the people who have hurt you." Grace searched her grandmother's face, trying to decide if she could believe that. "What if I make him mad?" "You will." Grace blinked in surprise. Her grandmother chuckled softly. "We all do." "Then won't he leave?" Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears. "No." She shook her head with quiet certainty. "That's exactly what makes him different." Grace carried those words with her for years. Sometimes she believed them. Sometimes she only wanted to. She couldn't have known that one day, decades later, those same words would become the thread that kept her from letting go completely. Because life was about to ask a question far harder than any little girl should ever have to answer. Not whether God was good, but whether he was still good, when every prayer seemed to echo back unanswered. Thank you for listening to The Letter I Hid for 32 Years. The story continues next Saturday at 9 p.m. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss this powerful testimony. God bless you.